and welcome to the very first episode of the Dynamic Duel podcast, where we review superhero films and debate the superiority between Marvel and DC by comparing their characters in stat-based battle simulations. I'm Joseph, also known as Marvelous Joe.
And I'm his twin brother, Jonathan, aka Johnny DC.
And I know that Marvelous Joe is kind of a horrible moniker to bestow upon yourself, but it was just the only thing that I could think of that had the word Marvel in it. And it's, a way to tell us apart, because you may have already recognized that our voices sound alike. We are twins.
Right.
So, I don't know, just, I guess, bear with us if you're having trouble understanding who's who. I think you'll probably be able to tell through context. Exactly.
Right.
So, like, the one who's always like, Superman, Man of Steel's the best. That's Johnny DC.
No, the one who's like, I'm a fucking asshole. That's the Marvel guy.
Right. So, in this first episode, we're going to go ahead and introduce you guys to who we are and how we got into Marvel and DC individually, and what to expect from this podcast. Full disclosure, what you're listening to right now is actually a re-recording of the first episode, in which the original was just god-awful.
It was unlistenable. We had to do this because first impressions are important.
Considering like the anthology nature of this podcast, a lot of people will go back and listen to the first episode, we've noticed. And so we didn't want you guys to just drop off, at the first sign of suckage. So let's go ahead and get started with what this show is. Basically, we are a weekly podcast that produces episodes once a week, every Tuesday. And our format is broken down into two different types of episodes.
Yeah, primarily we're known, or at least I would hope we are known, for our duel episodes, in which we pit a DC character against a Marvel character, but I think in a unique way.
Right. Well, it's done in the same way that the Deadliest Warrior television show on Spike TV used to do, where they would compare the characters, gather statistics on each one, and then use that data to run 1,000 simulated fights between them and find out who would actually be the winner.
Yeah, we use a probabilistic model known as the Monte Carlo method, which is used across a variety of applications, everything from, video game AI simulations to business risk analysis.
Right. Basically what the model does is it plots a random figure based on the original stat along a bell curve. And in our case, we use a standard deviation. So it's a pretty standard bell curve unless we need to expand or decrease it, given the nature of the powers to account for weaknesses and stuff like that.
Yeah. And variables. It's all very mathematical, but ultimately it's very accurate.
Right. So we take the characters, we'll go ahead and break down the history of the characters, their powers, and then we'll speculate on how we think one of those simulations would actually play out.
Which is probably one of my favorite parts of doing this entire podcast.
Right, exactly. So yeah, we kind of like develop a scenario for ourselves and talk about how the fight would go, what moves each character would do, and things like that. And then once we're done with that, we'll actually go ahead and run the actual simulations to come up with a definitive winner between the two characters.
Why all the work, you may be asking? Why go through all the trouble? And the answer is really because we've been having these debates our entire lives. And that's sort of why we started this podcast, in one part. The other part is being that we're really big fans of film.
Right. We like to consider ourselves movie buffs. I know a lot of people out there consider themselves that, but we count ourselves among them, I guess. So in addition to the dual episodes, you'll also be getting Marvel and DC movie review episodes. Now, in addition to movies, we also include streaming shows that release all at once. So say the Marvel Netflix shows like Daredevil, Jessica Jones, things like that. We'll review those as well.
Yeah, DC doesn't really do that.
Right. But we'll also include the animated films that don't go to theaters necessarily, but, are direct to video.
Yeah, really any feature-length film we're going to review.
Right, exactly. We love sharing our insights. So we're not movie experts, but we are movie lovers, and we like to share that passion with you guys regarding these films. You'll get the Marvel side of things and the DC side of things. So depending on the movies, you'll kind of tell which of us liked it more along the way. One of the reasons we started this podcast in January of 2016 was because of the emergence of the DC cinematic universe. Right. It was at that point we were just a few months away from the release of Batman vs. Superman: Dawn of Justice, which was a sequel to Man of Steel. Up until this point, DC had never really had a shared universe among its characters. Like, we were just coming out of, the Nolan trilogy and everything like that. And then we had the Man of Steel movie, and then all of a sudden you have Batman sharing the same cinematic space with that Superman movie.
First time their characters interacted.
Right. Also, DC had a lot of movies on their slate that were scheduled to come out, such as Wonder Woman,
Suicide Squad, which came out that same year.
Right, exactly. And it was also part of that same shared universe. So we figured that at that point, people were going to start realizing that there was a difference between Marvel and DC, that DC, was a thing, and that there was a rivalry. So we're like, this is perfect timing. People are going to be more cognizant of the rivalry, and that's our kind of jump-in point.
And I realized over time that more and more people were becoming aware of Marvel, and I was like, we need to nip that in the bud. Like, real quick.
What?
So yeah, in part, one of my biggest reasons for doing this podcast is just to create a legion of DC fans that will take over the world.
But in reality, what you're doing is just reinforcing the Marvel fans' passion and showing everyone just how lame DC is in comparison to Marvel.
I disagree, sir. I disagree.
All right. So we got the types of episodes that we'll be doing, the review episodes and the dual episodes. We'll also be going over the comic book movie news that came out within that week.
Yeah. We're both journalism majors from school, so we definitely like to talk about the news that's currently ongoing. So anything regarding trailers or casting announcements for movies or television, it's primarily on-screen news. So not too much from the comic books.
Right. Yes. We do read the comics. However, there are a ton of comic book podcasts out there, and honestly, there's a ton of comic book movie podcasts out there, but that's our focus, is the movies. Now, the reason that's our focus is because while I do read the comics, I'm a Marvel Unlimited subscriber, so all the comics that I get are 6 months behind the normal release schedule, so we can't talk about the latest releases because we haven't got them yet.
Yeah, I definitely don't buy nearly as many comic books now as I did when I was in high school. It's much easier to buy a $10 movie ticket every month than it is to drop 25 large
every week. Yeah.
Is 25 large $25?
I don't know.
Okay.
So yeah, it'll be comic book movie news that you're going to get from this podcast.
In addition to the news and the reviews and our other segments, we like to do what's called a No Prize, which is an award that Marvel used to give out up until the 90s, I think, to readers who caught mistakes in their comics. It was kind of a joke. It was an empty envelope. Ours is sort of even more useless. Right now, it's just a JPEG that I add an illustration to. But I think it's cool.
It's fun to award to listeners every episode who write in and engage with us. Usually we either ask a trivia question or we have what's called a question of the week, in which we ask you guys a question and we pick from all the different answers our favorite one. But you can only be eligible to win the No Prize if you listen to our latest episode, because otherwise the No Prize has already been awarded. If you're interested in maybe having us drop a superhero for you, go ahead and skip to our latest episode and participate in the question of the week. Now that you have an idea of what the experience of listening to the podcast will be like, let's go ahead and get into our own personal histories with the franchises, just to establish nerd cred and inform you guys on why we may be equipped to discuss this content. So when we were young, our mom was a librarian, and we used to visit the library often, and she found this amazing book for us to read, and it was called Marvel: 5 Fabulous Decades of the World's Greatest Comics by Les Daniels. And it was a fantastic book. Not only did it get into the entire publishing history of Marvel Comics up from its inception with Timely up through the early 90s.
Yeah, I forget how old we were when we got that book. We must have been in 3rd, 4th grade, I think. But the book itself just had some great profiles of the characters, and I think that was what I found most interesting, was getting to know the characters.
Yeah, it was my first introduction to characters like Daredevil and the Punisher and Wolverine, the X-Men, things like that. And in the back of the book, the comics that they had were This Man, This Monster comic with the Fantastic Four. That's a classic Ben Grimm story. They had Wolverine the Hunter, which was a Frank Miller book on Wolverine. They had the first appearance of the Vulture in the Amazing Spider-Man comic way back when.
Yeah.
And I think lastly, they had a Golden Age Submariner comic.
Yeah, it was just a great way to learn about these characters. And still to this day, when someone asks me oh, where do I start? I usually recommend that they get an encyclopedia of the characters.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So from that onboarding point, I started heavily collecting comics once I got a job and was able to afford them as a young teenager in high school, and started collecting comics from like the late 90s to the early 2010s. I was collecting them religiously and kind of dropped off once, I met my wife and she didn't want me keeping the comics around. So I started at that point collecting and reading them digitally.
Yes, I also collect them digitally now. By the time we started buying comics, I was already a DC fan.
Right. How did you turn to the dark side?
When we were, I think, in 6th grade, we had neighbors who started collecting Superman comics during the Death of Superman storyline. And they had collected all the way up through, I think by that point, Superman had split into twins, the blue and the red,
right?
Which it was an instant hook. I was like, oh, twins!
The electric Superman.
Yeah, the electric blue and red Superman.
Yeah.
So I started off, reading The Death of Superman, and I couldn't get enough of it. It was such a good, captivating storyline that sort of encompassed the entire universe and dealt with all of these really fantastic characters. So I didn't realize we're not a part of Marvel. I thought all comics were Marvel.
Right. Well, and then from Death of Superman, you went into the Reign of the Superman, and that led you into the Justice League books, JLA, right?
Yeah, that's right. Some of the first comics I bought were JLA stories, back when Grant Morrison was writing. And I just found the characters so much more iconic, inspirational, and aspirational. Like I wanted to be like them. They were like these flawless archetypes.
All right, so you've started explaining a little bit about why you think DC is better, but what I would like to do with this episode is to kind of get into a duel ourselves.
Oh, it's on.
Johnny DC versus Marvelous Joe, and kind of a point-counterpoint kind of segment where we debate who is actually better between Marvel and DC and why.
Come at me, bro.
I'm going to start off by saying that Marvel, I think, is superior because our characters are more relatable, and that is superior to DC's more iconic, aspirational characters because it's a fantasy thing. People want to project themselves into their heroes, and that's what Marvel lets people do.
I think in a way, DC makes people feel like they don't have to be who they are. They could be so much better. They could be Batman if they were dedicated enough. They could be as heroic and truthful as Superman.
People could be Captain America.
With Marvel, it's like, I could be an alcoholic, so I'll be an alcoholic. I could be a nerd, so I'll be a nerd. No, you could be better than that.
Well, those faults, I would say, make Marvel more interesting. Like, if you like interesting characters, you're going to be a fan of Marvel. DC's characters are not that interesting because of their archetypical nature. They don't have many faults.
It's kind of true that they perhaps lack character. Hal Jordan is probably a great example of that.
Uh-huh.
But because of their archetypical, iconic nature, their stories are so much more grand and so much more almost mythical in nature. I don't necessarily, like, I'm a big mythology fan. I don't necessarily need to project myself into the gods of Olympus.
Mm-hmm.
I just like to get caught up in these fantastic tales of these larger-than-life characters in a world that is so much grander than the one I live in.
Well, I mean, okay, so yeah, Marvel is based more on the real world. A lot of the stories take place in New York City as opposed to Metropolis and things like that.
Yeah, they take place in one location.
But, we also go out into, like, outer space and things like that. The Marvel tales are sufficiently grand. I mean, look at stories like the Infinity Gauntlet, like Earth X, the Kree-Skrull War, even more closer to home things like Civil War was a great tale, which was also like a real-world ethical tale.
And I would say even before they got to those storylines, DC was already like 10 steps ahead of them with introducing things like a multiverse. So you have these universal crises.
Marvel has
but we have multiversal crises.
Marvel has a multiverse as well. But what you guys don't have are stories that matter to real-world experience. Like, you take the X-Men, who are characters that face adversity in their lives because of who they are genetically. That's stuff that happens in the real world. It's relevant to our culture. How is DC ever relevant? Like, what have they done?
They're not relevant, like, on an identity level, maybe. They sort of represent everyone. They are relevant on a more sociological and moral, I think, level.
Uh-huh.
Take Watchmen, for example.
Watchmen isn't even DC, man.
It is
you
DC.
Keep bringing that up.
It is DC.
DC purchased it, But it was like it wasn't originally published by DC, right?
No, it was.
Oh.
This was before the Vertigo imprint or anything like that.
Okay.
Yeah, it was published by DC.
Whatever. It's like not part of the DC universe.
Are you saying it's because based on Charlton characters?
Yeah.
Still DC.
Whatever.
Sandman, still DC.
Okay.
This takes place in that universe.
Uh-huh.
Dark Knight Returns, still DC.
Still waiting for the social relevance.
I just gave it to you.
With Watchmen and Sandman?
Yeah.
I guess. I don't know. Well, Marvel's characters don't have shitty weaknesses to kryptonite.
I knew you were going to bring that up.
Uh-huh. That's one of the character-wise, DC has worse characters because, they give them all the powers, and the only way you could beat them is like with this like one little weakness thing, not like getting beaten to death, which is like a real weakness for a lot of characters.
That's not even true.
And all of your characters...
Superman was beaten to death, literally.
Whatever. But all your characters are like the same character. You have like 5 characters tops, and then everybody else is just a clone copy. Like, how many Green Lanterns do you guys have?
Gosh.
How many versions of Superman do you have with like the Steel and Superboy? The Bat Family. It's all just you just take your core characters and you just repeat it endlessly. Whereas in Marvel, we have a wide, diverse set of characters. Like no one else is like, oh shit. I was gonna say Spider-Man, but okay. So we have
how many Spider-Men are there?
God damn
They've been making a movie about it.
But like, who was like the Hulk? Oh, okay, granted,
Red Hulk, Amadeus Cho.
Shut up.
She-Hulk.
We have our legacy characters that they're starting to get into with Marvel and everything like that.
Yeah, I think it's relatively new for Marvel.
Yeah, it's
and again, DC is 10 steps ahead of the game.
Oh my god. In that sense, I would say you're 10 steps behind, and we're kind of walking backwards. But yeah. Well, I think that was a pretty good debate, sir. Let me shake your hand. Don't slap my hand, asshole. All right. But I guess some people out there would probably say, well, why do you have to side with one or the other? Why can't you just like both Marvel and DC? And the answer to that is...
DC's better, that's why.
Sibling rivalry. Growing up as twins, we kind of needed to find ways to establish our individuality from each other because a lot of people would always get us confused and stuff like that. And it actually got to a point where some of our friends who wouldn't be able to tell us apart would start a conversation off by saying, like, Marvel rules. And if the response was, hell yeah, it does, they knew they were speaking to Joseph. Or if they said, fuck that, they knew they were speaking to Jonathan.
That's not even exaggerating either.
But I think that the rivalry is fun.
It's healthy.
Essentially. And there may not really necessarily be a rivalry between the companies, maybe. I mean, they are competing companies, but the rivalry is more amongst the fans.
Right.
And that's who we think we represent.
It's sort of like the brothers from that 90s storyline of DC versus Marvel, who sort of encompassed their own like respective comic universe, and then they like pit characters against each other. That's what this podcast is.
Right. Why did the brothers in that story do that? Well, for fun, basically. So we hope you guys will join us in embellishing this rivalry through our episodes. And just to recap, again, you can look forward to review episodes, to duel episodes. We will also be sprinkling in like end of the year awards episodes, as well as news recaps around the time of San Diego Comic-Con. So yeah, that's what our format will be, and that's our show. This will be a little bit of a shorter episode, but we hope you guys join us in our subsequent episodes, which get better as we go along, honestly. Yeah, some of the earlier episodes were still just a little bit rough, but, we catch our stride, so...
I think probably near Etrigan Ghost Rider. I think that's where I caught my stride.
Yeah, probably.
If you want to reach out to us, we're all across social media. You can reach out to us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or you could email us at dynamicduelpodcast@gmail.com.
Right, if you visit dynamicduel.com, you can get links to all the social media accounts we have, as well as our merch store, where we sell lots of Marvel and DC related items, including t-shirts and mugs and stickers and all that stuff. So go ahead and check that out again by going to dynamicduel.com.
Yeah, so don't forget to rate, review, share, and subscribe. Thank you so much for listening.
Our next episode will be a duel episode where we find out who would win in a fight between Batman and Moon Knight. So go ahead and look forward to that. Yeah, and we hope you enjoy what's to come.
Up, and away.
True believers.